So this module is a big one. When it comes down to it, the main thing you do in an IDE is work with code. That's kind of the whole point of an IDE. Rider provides a lot of very powerful functionality to help with this, from helping you quickly navigate your code base to helping you with hints and suggestions about your code. Also, it can do a lot of code modifications for you to save you typing them manually. You may have guessed by now that I'm a huge fan of keyboard shortcuts. The extra productivity you get from learning them is huge. A lot of the things I'm going to show you in this module can be done by clicking with the mouse, i.e. icons in the left-hand gutter of the editor window, but I'd strongly recommend spending time to learn the keyboard shortcuts. And in the videos in this module, I'm going to be covering a lot of keyboard shortcuts. I'd highly recommend following along yourself and trying the hotkeys, but also taking notes. The act of taking notes helps you remember them. But as I mentioned in the last section, whilst you're doing your day-to-day coding, just take a couple of shortcuts at a time from your notes and use them as part of your daily coding. Once you feel comfortable with those, then add a couple more. So build up over time. Unless you have a far better memory than I do, it's probably counterproductive trying to learn too many at the same time. But saying that, I'm going to go with the fire hose approach in this module and show you a lot. You can obviously rewatch the videos in this module as you start to add more and more shortcuts to your muscle memory. Still follow along with the shortcuts I'm going to show you now though, just to give you a broad idea of what you can do. I've created a super minimal .NET solution that you can download to follow along with, and I'll introduce you to this in the next video. In this video, we're going to focus on functionality that can help you navigate your code. So this is the playground.net application that I mentioned in the overview in the last video. You can download the zip of this to follow along. I wanted to keep it super simple, so I wouldn't normally structure a project like this, but I've literally got a couple of handlers, an interface, and a couple of implementations, and then the entry point. So this is just a console application, and the entry point news up the handler and runs execute on it. That handler news up an implementation of something else and calls a method on it. That implementation has an interface, and that interface just has a property and a method. And there are two implementations of this interface. There's my implementation, which we've just seen, which has got a public method which calls a private method. It's also got that property implementation, and there's another implementation of the same interface. So super simple. I just wanted the bare minimum just so I could show you how to navigate around. So let's start off with how do we switch files. Control Tab is quite a common one. Lots of different applications do it, so you can switch between the tabs that you've got open. And it remembers it in the most recent order, so I can Control Tab backwards and forwards. You may have also noticed when I did that Control Tab that we've actually got all of these down the side. So you can use these shortcuts by the number, or you can just use the cursor key to go down. So I could go to like commit, and that opens up the commit window, which we'll talk about later on in the course. Another thing you can do with that Control Tab is, say I've got lots of tabs open, these are my open tabs, I can press the delete key if I want to close them. So I've got lots of tabs open, which I quite often have. This is a very quick way to zoom through and just close tabs that I don't want anymore. Another very similar shortcut is Control, and again, mark command, not control, but Control comma. And that looks very similar. It just shows recent files you visited, not just tabs you've got open. And you can filter by show edited as well. So now let's have a look at navigating code like methods, classes, and that kind of thing. Now there's a shortcut that I was very tempted to include in the big three in the last section, and that's navigate to. So that's Alt and backtick. And again, this is context aware. So depending on where you are, you will see different options here. The reason I didn't include it in my big three is because I very rarely use this because I've learnt these shortcuts. So this is really useful for discoverability. If you're just learning shortcuts and I want to know how do I go to the implementation, I can do Alt backtick, and then I can see that the declaration is F12. So I can F12 to go to that method. There's other things like show usages and various other options. So for discoverability, this is a really good hotkey. And as we can see, we can use like F12 to go to the declaration. So let's do that. And that's gone to the declaration. So I can do the same here and go to this declaration, and the same here to go to that declaration. And if I go to the interface, F12 again, so I can step through. Here, if I click on here and do Alt and backtick, we can say go to implementation. And because there's two implementations of this interface, it'll give you a choice. Another option, instead of doing F12 to go to implementation, is if your hand is on the mouse, because I do use both. I know I'm a big fan of keyboard shortcuts, but I do use the mouse as well. then you can control click to go to a method. So if we go to the very start program, if I hover the mouse over here, there's no change. But if I press the control key or command key and hover the mouse, you can see it goes underlined and it highlights it slightly. If I click, then that takes me to that. So that's a nice way of stepping through. So you can see I'm jumping through the call stack. This is also context aware, so it's not just going to the declaration. So if I control click on my public method, it's actually choosing a usage. If I go to my interface and click here, again, it's finding the usage. And the same if I go here. Now with this one, this is a property and we can see it shows the usages. Let's make that a little bit bigger. So it's also showing read and write instances. So we can toggle here whether it's showing just the read, just the write, or both. Now this is probably a bad example because these instances are doing both read and write because it's got to read it to increment it. But if I go back to this again, then hide the read, you can see that it is modifying it. Here you can choose the scope. So you can choose the scope of what you're searching for usages. You can also open it in the find window, which will appear at the bottom. So that's down here. You could also click on this icon, which shows a diagram of usages. So there's lots of tools to help you see where your code's being used. But going back to here, I was showing the control click, which again goes to definition, or it can find usages depending on what you're clicking on. If you want to explicitly find usages, again, as we've discovered from Alt and backtick, in my case, it's Shift F12. So if I click on here and do Shift F12, then we get this pop-up. So it doesn't do the pop-up, it just takes it straight down here. And along the side, we've got the same kind of filter options. You may have noticed that we've also got these hyperlinks above, like methods and classes and things. This is called code vision, and there's various different metrics along. So I can see my name here. That's because this is in Git. And by clicking on it, it's shown the annotations. So you can like do a Git blame here, and we'll talk more about Git later on in the course. So let's right click here and close. If we do more, then configure, then this is going to show a bunch of options and metrics we can see, and you can customize where that appears, or you can just turn it off if you really don't like this. So in this case, it's saying 2 implementations. If I go to that and go to one of the implementations, here I've got 2 usages. So I can then go to one of the usages, and we've seen this pop up already. And depending on what we're looking at, there'll be other metrics there too. If we close this window down, the next thing I want to show, if we go to my implementation, which has got a couple of methods in, if you do Alt and backslash, then it pops up this. Now this is really handy for quickly jumping between methods and properties and things within your current file. So imagine you've got a really big file with lots of methods. You can Alt backslash and then very quickly jump around to the different things. This is very similar. If you press Control Shift and F, then you get a structure window. So if you prefer this always being as a pane, that's a very similar thing. I can jump through and see what's in my current file. Another way you can jump through things in your current file is Alt. So you can press Alt and up and down, and then that jumps between these things. So that's Alt and up and down, or Option and up and down, if you're on the Mac. Whilst we're looking at jumping up and down with the keyboard, one useful shortcut is Alt minus. And that basically jumps to the last active location you were in your code. And this works across files. So if you've quickly gone off somewhere else, say I'm here and then I go to program, I'm looking at something, then I want to go back, I can press Control and minus and it jumps me straight back. So there's a navigation history there almost. And you can do Control Shift and minus to go the other way. Another one which is quite common in code editors is Control G for go to line. So I can quickly jump between different lines. You can also choose a column number, and down here we can see what the current line and column number is. Another bit of functionality which I love, which is so useful, which I've never seen other people use before when pair programming, is incoming calls. And as an example for this, if I click on my private method, and again I'm going to do Alt and backtick just to show this discoverable menu, just to show you. And to discover this, I'm going to show you another shortcut. You've got Alt and backtick to show navigate to. You've got Control Alt Shift and A for inspect this. And again, as I mentioned at the start, if you're not a keyboard shortcut fan, you can click on these icons in the gutter and you get like the context aware options. So we can see navigate to, which we've seen. We can see inspect this. We can see refactor this, which we'll be looking at in an upcoming video. So you can see by clicking somewhere, a lot of these other menus are very discoverable, and then you can learn these shortcuts. and learn the functionality too. But what I'm interested in is the inspect this. And actually we've got incoming and outgoing calls there, which is what I want to show you. But you can also go to inspect this and see it here as well. The incoming calls. If I click this, then this gives you a kind of almost like reverse call stack. So if I just expand these out, I can see all the different call stacks of what calls into my method. So this is very powerful for discoverability. Obviously, this is a very simple project, but imagine a really big project and you're getting a bit confused about what calls what throughout the big code base. This reverse call stack tree view is so useful. Whilst we're talking about navigation, the last thing I want to show is just finding and replacing in files. So if I do Control-Shift-F, you're probably very used to this from other editors and IDEs or even like Notepad. But it's pretty standard. You've got the match case, match words, you can do regex searches, you can change scopes, solution project directory, you can filter by different extensions. You've got a preview, so as I can click through, you can preview them. You can click open in find window, and you can see here it says control and enter. So I'll do that. So that opens in the find window. And as I click through these, we've got the preview, and you can live edit in the preview, or you can double click to go in your main window. If I want to go back to the pop-up, I can do this cog for settings, and I can tweak my search criteria. I can also, if I close the structure window there, I can right click on any folder and say edit and then finding files. There's also replacing files. If I do finding files, it does it in that folder. Replacing files was Control-Shift-H, and pretty standard, it's got a find and replace. Again, you can do it across the solution, the directory. So I won't go too much into this because it's fairly standard. One nice thing though is, if we see here, see how it says preserve case? Quite often if I copy and paste a class, a file, and then I want to find and replace all instances of a particular word, say I want to replace order for product or something like that, throughout that file, some of the instances of that word product might have a capital P at the start, and some might have a lowercase. By doing this, you don't have to do two case-sensitive find and replaces. This can handle just keeping that original case, which is really useful. Last thing, quickly show, while we're looking at navigation, if you've got a file that's got lots of things in, so I don't really have a file with lots of things in, but let's use this as an example. If you want to collapse a few things just to make it a bit easier to work with, if you hover the mouse over the gutter, you can see this downward arrow. So I can collapse things like that method, or this method, or your entire class. If you were using regions, please don't, then you can collapse those as well. And sometimes that's quite nice just to simplify what you're working with. I find it very useful if I'm working with like a JSON file or something, and I'm viewing JSON in here, and I can just collapse big collections or that kind of thing. So that's probably enough navigation tips for now. As I said at the start, I would recommend just taking a few and just practicing a few at a time so it slowly sinks into your muscle memory. In this video, we're going to look at how Rider analyzes your code and makes different suggestions. So we're in this My Implementation file. Again, you can download this, and I've just added some temporary code to my method. It doesn't actually do anything. I just wanted to show some code with warnings. So all it's doing is I've got a list. I'm calling getItems, which is down here. This just returns an array. I'm iterating over those items. If the item starts with foo, which this one does, then I will add it to the list. From a business point of view, it doesn't achieve anything. It's just some code that we can play around with. But we can see we've got some squigglers, like under my list. If we hover over, it mentions like a warning that my list is never used. It's updated but never used. getItems, if I hover the mouse over, dereference of possible null reference. We've got a green squiggly here, which is a suggestion saying it can be converted to a link expression. But it does warn you that it will add under the hood another getEnumerable. So whilst it be cleaner code, it might be less performant, but at least we're being informed about that. Down here, we can see we've got various things that are grayed out. And on the right, we can see we've got these yellow bars, which kind of show you the entire file. It's kind of like a map of the entire file of warnings and errors and things. If there was an error, let's just do an intentional error. You can see it's gone red, and you can see we've got red in this bar. Let's undo that. We can see at the top, there's one at the top. If I go to the very top, then there's an unused using statement, which we'll also get rid of. So these kind of warnings, now this might have changed, and I don't want to say too much bad about Visual Studio, but from experience, I quite often see a big difference between code that's been written by a Visual Studio developer versus a Rider developer. Quite often, code that's been written by a Visual Studio developer, whilst Visual Studio warns about these things, it's less in your face, so it's less obvious. So quite often I see code, like all warnings like this, where more often, if the code's been written by a Rider developer, then they would have fixed them because Rider's a bit more in your face and it helps you out a bit more. Standard disclaimer, that might have changed more recently, but that's just my past experience. So we're not going to fix these warnings up yet. We'll do that in the next video. But what I do want to show you is when I clicked up here and we look at this bars, by clicking on it, we got this pane. So we can see like a pane showing all the warnings in this file. You've also got along here all solution files. And this shows everything across the entire solution. Now it's not showing anything here because if I do this eye icon, it's not currently showing warnings. So by clicking on that, it's just asking you to confirm. And now we get those warnings. So if you've got lots of warnings in different files, we can go through and tidy up the entire solution. This pane is called the Problems tool window, which you can get to down here, or Alt and 6. If we let's close this. Let's have a look at one of the suggestions. So this one is basically saying that that's redundant. We don't need that in this version of C#. If I Alt Enter, and this is a great way of learning new language syntax, it gives you the option to refactor it. Again, we'll do that in the next video. But what I want to show here is that we can actually change the warnings. So we can say this particular instance, we're going to disable it once with a comment, and that'll put a pragma beforehand. I'll undo that. Alt Enter again to get that back. I can disable it in the file with a comment. I can disable it and restore, so it'll put a pragma before and after. I can disable it for the method, for the class. I can also change the severity. So I can say, don't show that at all. I would rather keep my code like that. I can make it a hint, a suggestion, a warning, or even an error. Another thing that's quite useful is you can say, why is Rider suggesting this? So if I click on this, then it'll pop up a browser window with an explanation about that suggestion. So you can see out of the box, Rider gives you a lot of code analysis and suggestions. You can, if we click on this server-side analysis, they do have this, which you can run in your CI/CD pipeline and do various things. And it's actually for vulnerabilities, so that gives you more advanced analysis. Or you've got the Rosalind analyzers. You can use other third-party products like Sonar Cloud, and there's various others. But out of the box, you get an awful lot of warnings and suggestions to really improve your code. In the next section, we're going to look at tidying up some of these warnings using our favorite shortcut, Alt-Enter. So in this video, we're going to look at a lot of code modification and refactoring functionality. And we're going to be using our friend Alt-Enter a lot here. So let's start by fixing up those warnings we saw in the last section. So as we mentioned, the inspections have picked up quite a few different things, like we've got grayed out areas here. If we hover over, it explains why. We've got yellow squigglies here for warnings. We've got suggestions in green here. We've even got a spelling warning here as well. So going down here, if I do Alt-Enter, then it's suggesting that we use the targeted type new. And as I've mentioned before, we can do this here, and we can even do it across the entire solution. But if I just click here or press Enter, then it's changed it. But we've got another suggestion here, which says use collection expression. So Alt-Enter again, Enter, and that's changed it again. So again, we can see that this has really helped us discover new language syntax. If we look at this green squiggly, it says it can be made static, so Alt-Enter, Enter. So it's made it static. If I hover over this question mark, which is grayed out, it says that it can be made non-nullable, so let's do that. Alt-Enter, make method non-nullable. And you can see it's got rid of this warning here because now it's non-nullable. If I look at this for each, which says it can be converted into a link expression, Alt-Enter, I'll let it convert it, and it's changed it to this. Now, I personally prefer link to be on its own line. So what we can do, we can go to settings. So if you remember, it's Control-Shift and S. It might be different on the Mac or in your settings. And go to Editor, and then go to Code Style and C#. So there's a whole bunch of customizations here. I'm not going to go through them all, but just as an example, line breaks and wrapping here. I'm going to scroll right down. I believe it is this one, wrap chained method calls. So I personally prefer that being always chop. And when we save this, we can just save it, or we can choose whether it's going to be on this computer, personally just for this solution, or team shared. If I choose this, for example, and I'm going to head over to Git, this commit, and look at unversioned files, we can see it's created this file, which has that information, so that can be checked into source control. We'll talk more about Git and version control later on in the course. So now I've made that change. If I undo that and do this again, Alt Enter, convert to link expression, it's now done it how I would format it. I think I undid a bit too far, so let me just bring that back again. And then all these changes we did. So if we look at the top right, we can see we've still got some yellow, and I tend to aim to try and get everything green so there's no warnings, so that when I do get a warning it stands out and it's not lost in the noise. And you can see one of the warnings, this yellow one, is that this isn't used, which makes this kind of pointless, having this. So for now, let's just return it. Now, of course, we've got an error because this method doesn't take a return type. But again, we can use Alt Enter and we can choose to change the type of the method to that type. So you can see how we're kind of Alt Entering our way through things. But we've got another one. This return type isn't being used by anything that calls it. And if this was public, it would be checking the entire code base to see if anything was using it. So these grayed out bits are really useful for discoverability. So I'm only using it here. But what I can do is Alt Enter, introduce a variable. And I can tab through and give that a name, but I'm not going to at the moment because I want to show something else. That's obviously not an ideal name, but we'll come back to that. So we're kind of just moving the problem here because this is then unused. So let's just do something with that. It's a list of string and let's just for each through it. Now I'm going to talk about this in the next section when we talk about live templates, but I've typed for each. I'm just going to press the tab key. I'm going to type my private method. I'm going to press tab again and tab again. And let's just call it item because it's an item in a list. So again, you've had a little teaser for live templates, which we'll talk about in the next section. And let's just do console.write line item. So we are nearly with 0 warnings. We can see at the top, we've got the squiggly. And rather than clicking on it, what I'm going to do is press Alt and page up. So I can do Alt and page up and page down to go to the next warning. And we can see that this is unused. Alt Enter again. And then enter, and that's removed it. So now we've got green, which is what we were aiming for. So let's have a look at some other things we can do here. And again, this code doesn't really do anything. It's just code that we can play around with. So another useful shortcut is to inline something. So here, I'm assigning a variable, then returning it. So there's kind of no real need to actually assign that to a variable. We can just return this. So if I click on here, I'm going to mouse click over here, because if you recall, we've got these shortcuts, navigate to, refactor this, inspect this, generate code. And we've spoken about all of these, but again, we can discover them quite well by just clicking here and then choosing one. But it's the refactor, this one I'm interested in. So if we do Control Shift and R, then within the context of where my mouse is, where my cursor was, then we've got some options. And it's inline variable, which is quite useful, which is RI, so refactor inline. So let's use that. If I click here and do Control RI, then that has just returned the result. So it's basically inlined it. Going back to this variable, which is a bad name, my private method, another shortcut that you'll find yourself using very often is Control RR. Again, it might be different depending on your configuration. And you can see it's highlighted both there and there with the usages. So let's do that again, Control RR, and let's call this items. So I've just typed out items, and that's renamed it. Now, obviously, this is a very localized example, but the same shortcut applies across your entire solution. So let's take this public method and do Control RR. This time we get a pop-up, and I'm just going to put 2 on the end for this example, and then next. So it's changed that there. If I go to the interface, so if you remember the control and click, we can see it's changed it there. If I do Shift and F12 to go to the implementations, we can see the usages have been changed as well. So imagine a massive code base where you've got a method used all over the place, and you do Control RR, and you can just change it everywhere. And that applies to variables, properties, class names, anything you can think of, even project names and solution names. For a method or something that has a signature, you can also do, so let's do Control Shift and R again for refactor this. There's another option, change signature. And this does a pop-up. So again, you can rename it here, but you can do more things. You can change the return type, I can add parameters. So I could say string, I don't know, name, next. And it gives you a choice of how you want to handle that. So I tend to just leave it as this default one. If I do next, then that choice is giving me a to do. So I can go and fix that up myself. If I actually go to the implementation, control click, we can see it's added that there. If I go to the interface, that's there as well. And the usages have these to-dos in them so that we can follow the compiler errors to fix those up. I'll undo that change because we don't need that. And I'm going to change this back so it doesn't have the 2 on the end. Just like where I showed the controller RR can be used here or up here, for example, and different places. The same applies for control shift R as well. So if I do that here, we get refactor this up here, which is slightly different because it's context aware. But like, for example, we can do adjust namespaces. So that'll fix up the namespaces across the entire project in this case. I can do the same at a solution level. So we can start to see a few different patterns emerging with discovering shortcuts and functionality with just a very small amount of keyboard shortcuts. So for example, the control shift R for refactor this in different places. And in fact, any of these, when you click on the Alt Enter or this icon in the gutter, any of these navigate to refactor this, inspect this, generate code. All of these make it very discoverable, and you can use the same patterns in various different places, whether it's your code editor, and the cursor is over different things versus on the Solution Explorer. So let's have a look at some more things. Let's go to my implementation again. Let's collapse this and let's just write some code. Let's do if items is not null. So here, so a very useful tip here is when you're near the end of a line, you can do Control Shift Enter, and then that will kind of intelligently insert braces or finish off that line, which is very useful. And say, let's do if items count is greater than 1, for example. Control Shift Enter to finish that off. So let's go with that. So this is warning items is always true. So actually, let's just fix that. Let's make this nullable. Okay, so say we've got a bit of code like this. Now it's not actually showing us squiggly, I thought it would. But if we go into the if statement and do our usual Alt and Enter, we still have refactoring options. So we can invert the if statement, or we can do null propagation. So let's do that. So that has introduced another language feature, which has dramatically cleaned things up. Let's have a look at another example. Let's do a switch statement, and let's use items.count again. And then again, Control Shift and Enter to complete those braces. Now let's just do case 1. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var foo equals, so I'll do a string there, and we're going to say foo equals 1. And let's duplicate this line, so Control D. I'll change this to 2 and 3, change this to 2 and 3. So there, when I deleted it, I just did Control and backspace, and that gets rid of a word at a time. So very similar to lots of other editors and IDs and Notepad, I think. So what I want to show here is we've got this suggestion here, and I will bet this is change it to switch expression. And it does, it says convert to switch expression, which is a more modern language syntax. So if I've got code like this, it's actually suggesting, oh, this would be better as a switch expression. So I do enter, and it's rewritten it for me. So again, all these little things to teach you about language syntax and clean up your code. It's warning us that items can be null, because remember we changed it to nullable. So I can Alt Enter and do a check, and it's wrapped in an if statement. Or if I undo that, actually what I'll do is get rid of this. I don't need this anymore, because we only added that nullable return when we were demoing this thing. And we can see here it's telling us we don't need that anymore. But we've done that example, so I'm going to get rid of that. So what else can we show? Okay, let's do extract method, which is quite useful. So say you've got a big, long method which has lots of different things in, and you want to break it down into smaller private methods. What you can do, you can select a block, and again, Control Shift R for refactor this. And this time it's detected you've selected the block, so it's only showing one. Extract method, enter. And I can choose whether I want it to be a method or a local function. So I'll choose method. It's asking for a name. I can change things, but let's go with the default. And that's now created this method. It's moved it into its own method. And it's detected what parameters we needed, because this was done outside of that block we selected. It would also detect return values if that was required. In fact, if I Control Z to undo that, and let's say foo, let's just do console.writeLine foo, just so we're using that somewhere. And then I'm going to select this and do the same again. So Control Shift R for refactor this, press enter. We could have done Control RM to go directly to refactor this. In fact, let's do that. Control RM, and it's popped up that. I'll press enter, and I'll press enter again, select the defaults, and we can see because it detected that the code outside of that selected block required foo, it's going to return it. And then again, we can go here, actually, we can improve this code because we're doing what we did before. We're assigning a variable to return it, so we don't need that variable. So I can click here. So remember, Control RI to inline it. I can go to here, Alt Enter, and choose expression body member to clean that up. So that's then a lot cleaner. So you can see there, I wasn't doing any coding. I was just Alt tabbing or using these shortcuts to refactor it. Some other quick useful tips just whilst I'm here before we wrap up. If you've got the cursor over a property or method or something, and you do Control Shift Alt and up and down, you can move that whole method or property or whatever it is up and down. So I'm just pressing Control Shift Alt and up and down. So that's a great way to reorder things. The last couple of things I want to show in this video is auto format. So say this was indented wrong. In the options, you can configure this, but if I do that semicolon, it's fixed it. If that was indented wrong again, if I redid that closing brace, then it's fixed it up. You can also do Control Alt and Enter, and that does it across the entire file. So if I let's just mesh up the indentation. Let's do a few things. Do that. Let's put that on a new line, and then Control Alt and Enter. Then it's based on the rules you've given it in the settings or your editor config. It'll reformat it and tidy it up and make it neat again. In this case, I don't want that. So that's useful. You can also do right click and you can say reformat and clean up. So Control E and C in this case. And you can go through and do this kind of thing in bulk as well across the whole solution, the project you've just selected. So you can choose your scope here, and there's various different options we can choose. So there's a lot of stuff there, but as I say, it's very discoverable by using those shortcuts, by even clicking here and seeing these actions. And also, as I mentioned earlier, just as part of your day-to-day coding, just to introduce a few at a time so it starts to become more muscle memory. In the next section, we're going to be looking at these live templates. You've got a bit of a taster there, but they're way more powerful than I showed there. I'm going to dig into how to write and customize your own. So in the last video, you got a small taster here when we did this for each of live templates. And live templates basically allow you to type shorthand, which creates code for you based on templates. If we actually go to settings, so Control Alt S, and if we look at live templates down here, in fact, no, let's practice the Shift and type live templates. So we're practicing this discoverability. So we can see here, we found it here, and that's gone straight to it. If we go to C#, then we can see we've got like a long list of predefined templates. So if we go to the for, if we can find that, and click on here, we can see, oh no, for each. We'll look at, this looks more complicated. We'll look at that in a sec. For each. Oh, actually, this looks quite similar. So we can see we've got these things like type, variables, collections, selection, end. So let's break this down a bit. If we click on variables over here, then this shows those variables. And those are basically whatever you type into here. I could type $foo, and then edit variables, and it would appear there. I can then do change macro, and there's a whole bunch of macros around different things you can do. So for this one, it would start doing a code completion. We can insert things like the solution name. There's even somewhere a clipboard, so you can insert the clipboard content. So there's a whole bunch of things you can automatically do as part of your template. So let's cancel that and then close this. The end is basically where the cursor will end once it's created that code. And then these variables, you just tab through each one. So let's look at for each again. So think about where end is and think about these three variables. So if I do for each and then tab, so whatever you call those variables will be here as placeholders. And you can see because the macro that I showed you said trigger the autocomplete, then that's why this has popped up automatically. So let's choose items. And then I can tab again to go to the next variable. I don't want to change that, so I'm happy with the default for that one. Tab again. I will change this to item, which it's worked out for me, so I'll press down and enter. And you can see how once it's finished that, it's ended up here, which if I do Control-Shift-Alt again, we can see that's where the end is. This is actually if, but if you remember, I won't find it now, but the for each also had an end. The for each also had a selection. What the selection does is, and you can see here, this is using generation, surround, or both. So the selection is about the surround. So what that means is, if I cancel this, and then let's delete that. Let's also delete these two and this. Now you may notice as I'm doing this, like little things I'm doing which aren't really about what we're talking about, like deleting those lines. I'm actually using a Vim plugin. And I'll talk more about plugins later on in the course. But if you're seeing this being a block as I'm doing demonstrations, or me quickly doing things like deleting those lines, that's just Vim. But I'll make sure that doesn't affect the thing I'm demoing. So for here, the thing I'm demoing is the live templates, which aren't related to Vim. So if I select that now, so that's highlighted. And to discover what the shortcut is, if you do Shift and type surround, then we can see surround with live template. So we can see that's Control E and U in my case. So escape that. So if I do Control E and U, then it's popped up this. Because obviously when something's selected, I can't start typing that shortcut. Like for example, for each, I'm typing a shortcut, then pressing tab. But I can't do that when something's selected. So for here, I've got to use a shortcut like EU. And then it's showing me all the live templates that support surround. So let's do try actually. So that's wrapped it in a try block. And we can see we're still doing the variable replacement, so I can tab through those and change those. If I tab again, it's taking me to there. So it's taking me from there to there. Tab again. And that will be wherever the end is. But this block will be, if we find that try, selection. So selection is replaced with whatever your selection was when you trigger this surround. And again, here is where we specify whether a template is a surround template. Both obviously is surround as well. So for example, in the case of, well, in this one or for each, you don't have to have a selection, but it supports it. And just like I showed in the last video for the save, you can do this and you can choose whether it's saving for this solution personally. So a file that's in gitignore, I believe that will have like .user in the file name. And there's a shared one which would be in Git in source control. So you can share these options and templates with your team. So now let's create our own and find a real world use case where this can save us a lot of time. You've probably already heard of this, but Jimmy Bogart's mediator library, which I quite like. So let's just scroll down and let's go for some examples. I'm not going to explain what this does. This is out of scope of what I'm showing here, but let's just scroll down. As part of using mediator, you'd want to create a request class that implements iRequest. Also a handler that implements iRequest handler. So let's just use this as an example. Say you're using mediator quite heavily and you want to be creating lots of handlers. If I copy this now and then go back to Rider, and let's click this plus button to create our own. And I'm just going to say handler. So this is the shortcut that you start typing. And let's go mediator handler. I could do it as a surround, but for this, let's keep it simple. You can choose availability, so we can choose what languages it's for and various things. But let's start with that. And then in here, I'm going to paste that code in. So that was from the mediator documentation. So things we want to replace in here, for example, ping. So let's create a variable. Let's just call it rec type. And let's copy that. And let's replace ping here for rec type and here. Let's delete this and I'm going to say end. So that's where we want the cursor to end. So I think that's okay. So if I do save, so now let's just go down here. If I type handler and then tab, it's done that for us. And we can see that it's highlighted the rec type. So we can call that whatever we wanted. And I can see I've made a mistake here, like ping is still there. So let's just delete that and fix that up. So handler. So I didn't want ping here, so that was a mistake. and then save. And then let's do handler again, enter. So imagine this handler is getting product. So let's type get products. And we can see that's replaced both instances in one go because it was the same variable name, and it's left me in the middle where that end was. So you can see how this is going to be really, really powerful. Imagine a team that uses Mediator very heavily to quickly be able to create templates or whatever library it is, not just Mediator, it's whatever it is you use. Or even if you're sharing templates, custom templates with your team, it might be within your own code base. There's lots of patterns that your team repeats that you want to set up templates for. You might have very custom shareable templates. So you can see how if you build up a library of these templates for your team's code base, how powerful and how much time something like this might save. There's also another option called postfix completion. And what this does is, say I've got foo, for example, I could do foo dot null, this is an example, or not null, and then tab, and then that auto completes. So this postfix completion is where you start typing a word and you can do something. So I could do foo dot, if I scroll down to the bottom, we can see what I could be doing. So let's try for each, and items will be a better demonstration. So if we do items.forEach and then tab, then again, it's a very similar kind of thing, but it just allows you to do a dot and then the completion. If we do shift and then type postfix completion, so because I've searched for it, it's graying out everything that doesn't match that search. So if I do the X, and then that's not grayed out. But note that this only has TypeScript and JavaScript in the list. So don't think at the moment for C# we can create custom postfix completions. In fact, there is this support ticket about this. It's down as nice to have. If I scroll down, like 10 months ago, we've got people saying we still need this. So JetBrains, if you're listening, this will be really handy. And in the next video, we're going to be looking at bookmarks because that can also be a massive time saving. And it's one of those things that I very rarely see other people use. So in this video, we're going to talk about bookmarks. Now, I personally think that bookmarks are a highly underutilized bit of functionality in the IDE, not just Rider, but any IDEs. I work with a lot of developers, and I've very rarely seen anyone use bookmarks, if ever. So this project I created for the next module when we talk about debugging, so I'll be using this a lot in the next module, but I thought this would be quite useful to demo bookmarks too. And quite often when you're working with a code base, because quite often you're doing full stack development, you might be working on a feature, and you might be doing something on a front-end view, on some HTML, and that might call into an API, a web API in the same solution, another project. So you've got a controller, which then might call into a service, which might call into something, other layers. You'll have tests as well. So quite often when you're working, you're jumping between these different locations, and a lot of developers don't realize this, but this wastes a lot of time. It takes a lot of cognitive load, which you might not realize is happening, to find the other areas as you're switching backwards and forwards, where bookmarks can really help with that. So just quickly, I'm going to introduce this project more in the next module, but basically it's a web API project. So we've got a controller. The controller has two endpoints, which calls into a podcast service, a couple of methods in here. This also then calls into a podcast source, which is an interface, and we have one implementation, which is a hard-coded list. So I've intentionally got these different layers, so the controller, the service, a podcast source, because in the next module when I talk about debugging, I want to show the call stack, which shows a call hierarchy. So that's why I've done it this way, but this will work as a good example for bookmarks too, because I've got a test here as well. So this is just an integration test. So imagine this is my project, and the feature I'm working on, I'm touching all these different things. If I go to the controller, and as part of this work, I'm jumping backwards to this controller because I'm working with it. The starting point for bookmarks for shortcuts is Control K, and you'd follow that with another character depending on what you want to do. So to toggle a bookmark, Control KK. And you can see on the left-hand side in the gutter, there's this bookmark. If I press Control KK again, it'll go away. So that's a toggle. If you do Control KW, that pops up this window, and this is like a list of your bookmarks. And you can rename this by pressing the F2 key. So what my workflow tends to be, I would do KK, KW, and then F2 to rename that. So I can call this something like controller. Now it's worth pointing out that I tend to use bookmarks very temporarily. So I would give it a very vague name like controller. If I go to the tests and say the functionality I'm working with this test, I can just do KK, KW, F2, and then test. So that takes me to my test very quickly. Say the podcast source, and let's do the actual implementation. Say I'm working with this data quite a bit. Maybe this is an anti-framework call or something, and I'm jumping backwards and forwards to this. I can then do KK, KW to get that list up, and F2. So this can be data. So then when I'm working, I can very quickly jump around. So say I want to jump to my tests, I can do KW, down to tests, enter, and I'm there. Say I want to jump back to the controller, I can do KW. I can even start typing controller, then enter. Then say I want to go to the data, KW, type data, it was already there, enter, and it's gone to the data. So I can jump to where I want to go without much thought. Whereas if I'm having to control tab, or which one was it, where was it? Or if I've not got the tab open even, I've got to start finding it. I know you've got shift, so I can find it fairly easily there. I can do tests. So that shift is very helpful. But just having these bookmarks, you can very quickly jump between. You've also got a pin for this. So if you do Alt and 2, this pops this up. Or you can find it here. If it's not visible, it'll be in this list. And we can expand this and we can see, if we expand it again, we can see those named bookmarks. So if you want these up all the time, maybe you're more of a mouse person, so you just want to be able to click on it, then maybe this is the better option to have open. One thing I would change, you can see these are nested under the files. If you do this ... and you turn off group line bookmarks by file, then especially if you've named the bookmarks, I personally think this is a much nicer view where you've got the names so you can jump between the different places. And with a real project, you might have a lot more bookmarks. This is just a very small example. You can also, with this plus, you can create a bookmark list. So where I said that I use these quite temporarily, maybe you don't want to, maybe you want to actually store bookmarks in different places in your code base and have them more permanent. If you click this, you can give it a name. I can't think of a suitable name at the moment, so I'm just going to do foo. And I can drag these into that grouping. I can also right click and make that the default list. If it's the default list, if I add a new one, KK, then that's going to appear in the default one. And if I do Control KW, you'll see that's the one that's expanded and this is collapsed. And that's really useful if you do want to have different groupings of bookmarks. So if I delete that and delete that one. So that's it for bookmarks and also marks the end of this module. In the next module, we're going to be doing a deep dive in how to debug in Rider. So in this module, we're going to cover debugging in Rider. Now, some of you might have used debuggers a lot already, and some of you might have never touched a debugger. This module should have something for you regardless of experience level. I'm going to start off showing the debugger's user interface and go through the basics of debugging, but in this module I'll also show various other tips and tricks as we go along that you might not have come across even if you've been using Rider for a while anyway. So going back to this project, which in the last video about bookmarks we introduced, but it's this module I created this project for. So a quick reintroduction, we've got a web API project with a controller with 2 endpoints. You can get a list of podcasts either by genre, so you can specify a genre, or by search term. This calls into a service. So we've got up here, podcast service, and we've got get podcast by genre, and we've got get podcast by search term. I've intentionally done these as 2 separate methods because I wanted a for each loop and I wanted a link query to demonstrate some debugging things. Both of these get a list of podcasts from something called podcast source, which is over here. So we've got an interface and then one implementation, hard-coded podcast source. And to keep it simple, I've just got 3 podcasts in. My podcast, the Unhandled Exception podcast, Nick Chaptas's podcast, Keep Coding podcast, and a Kubernetes podcast. The genre, both mine and Nick's, is .NET. And for this one, I put Kubernetes as a genre. And there's also a test project, which just does an integration test and makes a GET request to that endpoint and verifies the status code. So super simple, and you can download this project to follow along. So imagine now we've got an issue and we want to debug it to find out what that issue is. Or you just want to step through the code and understand what it's doing. So first of all, to do this, you want to make sure that your project is using the debug configuration. And normally that's the default unless you change it to release anyway. But if you build your project in release mode, then it's going to do lots of optimizations, which makes debugging much trickier. We've already shown in this course this play button, and you can do Control F5 to just run your application. If you want to debug, you've got this button here. And whilst it says Alt and F5, you can just do F5. That's what I normally do. And if you're used to Visual Studio, F5 is probably quite familiar. As I've said before though, it might depend on your chosen key mapping. It might be different. So if we run this now, I can do that or press F5. Then it opens this debug pane. And we can see on the left hand side, this debug icon here has got a little green dot. So that indicates that we are currently debugging. And this is the debugging pane. If you're debugging multiple things at the same time, then you'll have multiple tabs here for the different things. So this might happen if you're running a Blazor application where you've got a front end and a back end. You can also, these configurations, which I've shown before, if you go to edit configurations, so these are the default ones we're running. You can do plus to do additional things. So you can see all of these options. You also have multi-launch, where you can add different configurations and launch them and debug them all at the same time. So this is handy if you've got like a microservice kind of architecture, or even just something that's got a front end and a back end, but different projects within your solution. So if you do that, let's cancel that, then you'd have multiple tabs here, and each tab has its own debugging window here with all its own different tabs. So one thing, if you're used to Visual Studio, you might be used to these buttons up here when you're debugging, using them to continue, where in Rider, it's more down here where you'll be working or using the keyboard shortcuts. So that is a bit of a gotcha coming from Visual Studio, because habit would make you click up here. And I think they have improved it. When we stop on a breakpoint in a sec, there used to be a play button up here, which if you pressed, it would restart, which was very confusing for Visual Studio users, because rather than continue debugging, it would restart the debugger. Basically what you wanted was this one here, so you'd click down here instead, which was quite a hard habit to get out of if you're a Visual Studio user. Now they have changed the play button, which if I was stopped on a breakpoint is up here. They've now changed that to continue because it probably confused a lot of people, so that is much better. But the point is, generally you want to be down here or using the keyboard shortcuts. So we've got stop, pause. If you've paused somewhere or you've hit a breakpoint, you've got this play button here. We'll talk more about these step overs as you're stepping through your code. You can view breakpoints, clear all breakpoints, and if you do the ... there's a few more options here, including various debugger settings. These tabs, threads and variables, which is empty at the moment, but when we hit a breakpoint and stop execution, then we'll be using this very heavily. Console is the standard console output, which you also see if you don't debug. If you just run it, it would show this anyway. Debug output is if you do, like say in code, debug dot write line. So it's any code that writes to the debug output. Parallel stacks is very useful. Again, we'll see that shortly. Modules shows everything that's been loaded, all the different modules as part of your application. I must admit, I never need to go in here. And tasks, again, empty. We'll see that shortly. So one of the key things you're going to do when debugging is actually stop execution in your code. So you can step through your code, you can look at variables, you can work out what's going on, because that's the whole point of debugging. If we go to one of our files, let's do podcast source. So this is basically the data layer. Obviously I'm hard coding it, but it might be calling Entity Framework or something. And if I click here, so I can choose, I can click here, and that does what's called a breakpoint. So that does this red dot. I can also use the F9 key to toggle. So now that we've got a breakpoint and we are debugging our application, then when our code hits this line, it's going to stop in the debugger. Now this is a web API project, so we need to submit a request to the API. When you create a web API project, it will also create an HTTP file. I'm going to talk about this later on in the course, but basically this can do an HTTP request, and you can do like query strings, different headers. You could have a body if it was a post request. It supports variables. But as I say, we'll dig into this later. All we need to know is we can click this play button or Alt enter, and it will make that request. Our address is localhost, so this is going to call into what we're currently debugging. So let's do that. Let's click on this. And we can see now it's hit our breakpoint, and this is lit up. We're in our threads and variables tab, and we can see different threads along the side. This is the one we're in. We can see the call stack. So this is the function I'm in. If I click on this or double click, then This is what called it. If I click on this, this is the controller that called that. So you can walk through how we got to the current place we've stopped. On the right-hand side of the call stack, let's move that across. Then we've got the list of variables that are in scope. So like this is the current class. We've got podcast because we know it's here. It's null at the moment because we've not actually run this line yet. Generally, when debugging, you want to step through your code. So if we look down here, see this green icon? We can resume it, or we've got these options, step over, F10, step into F11, so that would step into a method. If you were on a line that did a method call, for example, if you were here, you've got step out. So if you're in a method and you want to step out of it. So as usual, I tend to use the keyboard shortcuts. If I want to go to the next line, I can press F10. So that's now stepped down. And you can see this yellow arrow here, which shows where you've currently stopped, so where the instruction pointer is. We can also see other useful information. You can see over here, we can see podcast count is 3. So at a glance, without having to look down here, we can look down here and expand this. But at a glance, we can see inline in our code, the values of it. And you can even click on it. So you can get a pop-up and we can start expanding these objects. And if it's a string, you can click on view and you get more of a, imagine this was multi-line text, quite a big text file. This is much easier to work with to actually see the whole thing. If it's something like JSON, it would be nicely rendered. And there's various other things we can do here, but we'll touch on those later. Whilst we spoke about stepping through, so I pressed F10 to step over. So I stepped from here to here, and we've got this instruction pointer. One thing that's quite nice, now I'm just going to collapse this to show you because my font's quite big. You can actually drag this to a different point of code and it'll jump up so you can then step through again. You can also do the opposite way, so you can drag it down and it'll just jump over, it won't run this bit of code. You've also got various different like little overlays. So here we can say skip to cursor. So that does the same kind of thing. It'll just jump without running this code. You've got this icon, which is run to cursor, which we'll get to here, but it will run this code. And as usual, we can see little hints for what the keyboard shortcut is. So if we get that pane back up, so again, here it's got this green icon, and this has brought this up. So we've already seen this local window, which shows the local variables. You can also right click and say add to watches. So that appears up at the top here. If I press the insert key, then I can just type something else and you get the IntelliSense, and you can even call methods in here. I won't do that now, but it's quite powerful. You can also do the same down here, which is called the immediate window. If I drag this up, I'm going to single step, so F10 over, so I've got podcasts. So here I can evaluate stuff. I can do podcasts dot, and I can even do link queries. So let's say where x dot genre equals dot net. And you'll notice that's actually added it to the watch window. I could have done blah equals, and we can see it's created a section with actual variables in there. If I get rid of this and type blah, I can interact with that variable. So this is really useful for just inspecting things. So we've spoken a bit about breakpoints, but we haven't covered this in depth. If we go back to where our breakpoint was, so we can either click here and we can see our breakpoint here. Or if you remember in the last section when we did Alt and 2, we saw this bookmark window. This also shows breakpoints. If we right click on our breakpoint, then we get a few options. You can disable them. I'll come back to this in a sec. You can add conditions. If I go to more, then we get more options. And again, we can see enabled and suspend execution. So by default, it will suspend, as we've already seen. If we untick this, we can do things like log a message or log the stack trace. Or you can do a more custom log based on an expression. You can do things like once the breakpoint's hit, you can automatically remove it. And there's various different options, including hit count. So you can say, based on these predicates, then you hit it when it happens. So for example, equals 500. Now imagine you've got a loop that runs lots and lots of times and you don't want to press continue F5 500 times to get to that iteration, then you can do something like this. Or you can do a condition. So a condition allows you, in fact, let me escape this and create a different breakpoint. Let me close this and go to podcast service, and then let's go down to this one. So if I put a breakpoint here, and let's continue this, and then go back to my HTTP request and run it again. get rid of this breakpoint and continue. Actually, that was the other one. I need to run this endpoint to get to that bit of code. So now we've got podcast title, and you can see that we can mouse over to see things as well. So if we go to podcasts, expand this, we can see we've got 3 podcasts in the list. And the first one is my one, the Unhandled Exception podcast. If I expand, let's use Kubernetes as an example. So if I right click on here, I can do it here or do more and do it here, a condition. And let's pull this down a bit. We can see podcast title. Let's go with that. So we can start typing podcast.title.contains, let's say kube. And you can see it's got a question mark here now. So if I just continue this, and then I'm going to run that again. So go to HTTP, run this HTTP call again, and it's hit this. But this time, if I hover over title, it stopped when that condition has been hit. And that's kind of the fundamentals of debugging. That's a lot easier to work out what's going on rather than littering your code with lots of console logs all over the place. Just to quickly give you an example of if I go to the controller and put a breakpoint there and then go back to the HTTP and run this. So it hits that breakpoint. And then if I press F11, then we can see that stepped into it. So that's the same as doing this button down here. I can then F10 through it. And you can see the overlays here for .NET, for the genre. We can see the local values automatically populated down here. And then we can carry on stepping through. If you find yourself jumping into somewhere you don't want to be, you can jump out with this step out or Shift 11. So that's kind of the basics of debugging. In the next video, we're going to do a few different tips and tricks that you can do in the debugger. So in this video, I'm going to expand on the last video and just show you a few tips and tricks, which I think is really cool when debugging in Rider. Now this one, I suspect not a lot of people know. I've only recently learned this one, but let's put a breakpoint here and then let's debug this. And then if we go to our HTTP request, so Control Tab, and if you remember this from the last video, so if I just make that HTTP request, so if I remove that, and then continue execution. And again, we can do it from here. You don't need to move the mouse all the way down here if you're using the mouse, or you can press F5 to resume. So now we're here, and a very useful thing you can do with a link statement is if you hold down the Alt key, you can hover over each of these. And if you click, it's going to execute that and show you the result at that point. So for example, podcast, if we hover the mouse over podcasts, we can see this is the order. And if we look up here, we can see the genre we passed in is .NET. So we've got 2 .NET podcasts and something that isn't .NET. And this query is doing a where filtering by .NET. So hovering over this, we can see all 3. If I alt click on where, which is applying this condition, and then go to results, we can see it's ran up to this where clause. The Unhandled Exception podcast is on the top. And that starts with U, so that's not alphabetically sorted, which is what the next one is, ordered by title. If I alt click on this one and then results, we can see it is now alphabetically sorted. So being able to alt and click on a link query is, in my opinion, absolutely amazing. And as I say, I've only recently discovered this. So moving forward, this is going to be something I'll be using all the time. Whilst we're here, if we hover over podcasts and expand, so we can see all the information here, like title, genre, but you might not want this level of detail, and it might be an even more complicated object too. If you expand, you can pick one, say maybe the title. You can either click this flag icon here, or right click and say pin to top. If you do that, then it's collapsed it. But if we look again, then we can see it's only showing this here. And if we expand, the title is actually at the top and it's pinned. So that's really useful if your object has a key identifier, which you just want to see that in the list in the debugger. Another more permanent way of doing that is if we actually go to, I'm going to control click here to go to this object, you can add an attribute called debugger display and Alt enter to import the references. And you can see that AI, which we're going to talk about later, has very kindly done this for me. So I'm going to press tab. So what this does, this gives you a way of being a bit more explicit about how you want that to display in the debugger. And you can see it uses string interpolation. So I've got title and genre. So I'm going to restart the debugging. So I can click here. Then go back to the HTTP and run this again and click here. Then this hasn't actually worked because I've got something pinned. So let's unpin that and try again. Then we can see it's using that format that we specified in that attribute. Another cool thing you can do is if you right click anywhere, you can say add inline watch. So that is just done a text box in your code. As we type, we get the IntelliSense. And let's just do whatever. Starts with cube. And then I can click on this, and then we've got to explicitly evaluate that and then do results. And we can see that entry. But that's just inline, so that's there now for us to click on if we need it. So again, that's really useful. If you want to remove it, you can edit it and just get rid of that. Another really useful tip is if we stop this debugger, if you've got a bit of code you just want to repeatedly debug and test without running your whole application, is if you create a public, I need to do this within the class, a public static method, let's call it foo. Then by doing this, you can see we've got this triangle run icon, and you can do Alt-Enter as usual, and you can choose to run or debug it. Or if you want to click, you can run or debug it. So let's just do like console.writeLine, hello dome train, and then F9 to put a breakpoint, and then we can click here and do debug, and that will create a new configuration. And then we hit this. So that's really useful for just little snippets of code you want to work with. And if we stop this, because we've created the configuration, if we do it again, we can just run it and it'll go straight to there. Or you can press F5 to go straight to it. So Rider's full of just little quality of life improvements like that. Another example of these little things that can make your life easier. Say if you're doing authentication stuff and you're working with JWT tokens. If I just create a new JWT, now I'm just going to paste an arbitrary one rather than actually writing code. And then let's do F9 and then F5 to run this. If I view this in the debugger, so I go to view, then we can see it's actually intelligently decoded the JWT. So rather than having to go to like jwt.io or jwt.ms website to decode your JWT, you can just view it in the debugger. And the same applies if you were viewing JSON, it'd be like a JSON tab, so you can view it formatted and you've got the usual collapse and expand. I'm assuming the same for XML. I've not used XML in a very long time, but there's lots of little things to help you visualize your data. So if I stop this, a few other things we can do, if you've got a process that you're not running, you've not got the project for, but you want to debug it, say it's something running in IIS or something, then you can do this and do attach to process or Control Alt and P. So this is showing my processes. You could search and find your IIS process or whatever it is you want to remote debug. You can view it as a list or a tree. And you've also got the option of remote debugging. If you're doing remote debugging, say you want to investigate something on a different machine, you would have to install the remote debugging tool on the other machine so that your debugger can connect to it. And this link will take you to the documentation where you can download the tool and it'll talk you through it. Going through remote debugging is out of scope of this course though. So there's a few extra debugging tips, but so far we haven't really spoken about exceptions, which sadly in .NET we see a lot of. There are a few different things in Rider which are useful to know when dealing with exceptions, and we're going to talk about that in the next video. So just a quick one this time to talk about exceptions. So in this code, I've just added a entry which is null. As you can see, it has got a squiggly, which is warning because we don't have a non-nullable type here, but for this example, we're going to ignore that. Or maybe without thinking about it, some developers put the bang operator to ignore it without really thinking it through. So let's assume we don't know this is here and we are running our application in the debugger. And if we go to our HTTP and I'm just going to run it, then our output just says 500. So it's a 500 server error from our API. If I scroll up a bit, it does show my exception here, but it would be much better if this would stop in the debugger. So what I can do is I can press Control Shift and E, which opens up this dialog which we've seen before. You can get to this dialog with a Control Shift and B, but the difference when you do E is that it highlights this. And basically what you can do, you can enable it, and that means that any exception it will break on, the execution will break. So if I mark this as done now, and then run our HTTP request, then immediately it's landed when that exception was thrown. So that's now given me a clue as to that 500 error. I can see that we're inside this expression. I can hover over and I can see that X is null, which is one of the items in podcast. Unfortunately, because I've currently broken it inside the lambda, I can't view this podcasts collection. So what I'll do is I'll click here, pop another breakpoint in. So I can click or press F9, and then I'm going to restart. Okay, so back to HTTP, run it again. I've hit my breakpoint. I can inspect podcasts, pull down the list, and I can see it's null. So that's told me what the issue is. Now what I can do is I can actually drag this up to here. And I want to step into here because there might be more complicated logic in here. We know that in here it's just a hard-coded array, but imagine we don't know that. So if you remember, F11 will step into, and that's gone into it. F10 to step through, and actually there I can see that that's null. So that's very quickly helped us discover what the issue is. Pressing F5 has taken me back to here, and F5 again, it's hit the exception. So another thing you can do when you get this exception window is you can press this Stack Trace Explorer, which actually pops it down here. And you've got nice hyperlinks for different parts of the call stack. So I can click through. This Stack Trace Explorer is actually really useful if you've got this kind of text in some log somewhere and you've copied it in. So I'm just going to copy it here. Let's pretend I didn't get it from here. And I've just copied this from some logs. If I then stop debugging, so imagine I've just copied that stack trace from some logs file somewhere else, and I do Control ET, then that's popped up this Stack Trace Explorer again. And in the same way, I can click on these hyperlinks. If I press Control Shift B again to get this dialog up again, sometimes having this enabled all the time can get a bit annoying, but sometimes you do want it on. One example might be the task cancelled exception. So if I just say throw new task cancelled exception here, and then I'm going to debug again, then HTTP and run it again. So we've hit this task cancelled, and this might be something you just want to ignore, but you want to break on any other exceptions. Then when you hit this, you can choose this button here, mute and resume. So that's going to mute this type of exception and then continue. Going back to our Control Shift and B, we can see that this is now listed in this list, and we can see that it's added it and unchecked this suspend execution. So if I want to stop ignoring this now, I can just click on this and then press the delete key. So there's a few tips and tricks for dealing with exceptions. In the next video, we're going to look at disassembling and debugging into third-party code. So it's not just your own code that you can debug into third-party code as well. And as an example, let's introduce a problem. So here in this application, I'm trying to use .NET user secrets. .NET user secrets is a .NET concept where you can add basically configuration values, key value pairs that are more secret. And basically it's a JSON file that's stored on your computer but outside of your Git repository. So it's normally somewhere in your user folder. And .NET then layers up these configurations. So there might be environment variables, there might be values in app settings, there might be values in your launch settings. If you're connected to something like Key Vault, it might be pulling in key values pairs from there, but also this user secret file, and it layers them up. So in this scenario, it's not working locally. I can't work out why, so I need to debug into their code to find out why. And I know that user secrets and this layering of configuration we're talking about is all set up as part of this builder. And I also know that I can debug into third-party code. So what I'm going to do is click here and press F9. So that's done a breakpoint. And now if I press F5 to start debugging, I've hit this breakpoint, and as I normally would if it was my own code, I'm going to F11 into it. So this has now stepped into third-party code. And if I hadn't have stepped into this assembly already, it might have taken a few seconds to download the symbols and to disassemble it. So you might see a progress bar for a few seconds there, but for me it was instantaneous because it was cached. There's a few things here. We can see that the XML comments are very nicely rendered, and some have, there's none here, but if it's got a hyperlink, it'll be a proper hyperlink. This is actually called reader mode, and I can toggle here so you can see the XML, or up here, I can turn off reader mode so see the full XML here. That was up here, and if I click here again, it's going to bring it back on again. There's also this IL code as part of the code vision thing. If I click on that, then we can see the IL. So this create builder just news up a web application builder. And if I F11 into it again, it's going to go into the web application builder constructor. So as usual, I can F10 and step through this code to see what it's doing. So it's newing up a new configuration manager, F10, adding some variables that have prefix ASP.NET Core, F10. So stepping through code is a great way of learning the code as well. So this is going into here, and we've got another constructor here, and it's possible that's doing something. So I'm going to F11 into this too. So that's actually moved over here. If I F11 again, now that's gone into here. Now it's worth pointing out that if you F11 in to a constructor, it's going to start off by doing the object initializers for the fields and properties and things. Don't press F11 again, you want to press F10 to continue. So I'm stepping through these object initializers, then I will land on the constructor. And here there's something quite interesting. We can see this purple line here, which if I hover over, it says code analyzed by predictive debugger. And we can see there's lines which are grayed out. So the predictive debugger has detected that it will not get to this bit of code. And the reason is because it knows that setting is not null, so this won't be executed. And it knows settings configuration isn't null either, so that won't be executed. And we'll see this again shortly. So if I carry on F10ing through, so this is setting the default context root. I don't need to step into this because that's not going to be related to user secrets. Just carry on stepping, adding some environment variables with prefix.net, initialize, so I can step into this to see what this is doing. Now again, we can see grayed out bits, so we know that Rider knows it's not going to go into that. So without stepping forward, I can glance at these and know it's not going to hit these. We can see it's doing some other stuff. Now for time's sake, I know that user secrets aren't loaded in this file. If I didn't know that, I could carry on debugging through, but for now, I'm just going to step out of that. So Shift F11. I'm going to carry on stepping. Now this highlights that this is not foolproof because I have no idea why it steps over those two lines. But we can see it got confused, and it did. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a breakpoint here. So I wanted to show also that you can put breakpoints in third-party code and it will still stop there. And then if I rerun this, and then F5 to continue, so it's hit that breakpoint. And to avoid this jumping over again, I'm going to put another breakpoint here, and then F5. So that's worked. So I've no idea why it skipped those two lines, but it did. But that just goes to show that debugging third-party code isn't 100% foolproof. Because don't forget that, remember when I spoke earlier about debugging, how I said about debug and release mode? And the third-party code would have been compiled with release mode, so optimized assemblies. I'm going to talk in a bit about why we can actually do what we're doing here, but just for now, know that it's not 100% foolproof. So let me step into this one. So I'm going to step through this, and oh, we're loading like JSON files now, these app settings, so this feels close. And actually, I can see down here, it says add user secrets. So as I've stepped along, we can see that all of this grayed out. So the predictive debugger thinks that it's not going to get into here. In fact, this is grayed out as well. So it knows that it's not going to process to the right of this AND, which means that this must be returning false. So let's step into is development. F10. So clearly at this point, it doesn't think my host environment is development, which would explain why it's not trying to load user secrets. If I F11 again and step into it, so this is now doing a string comparison, so I must be pretty close. The environment name, development, host environment, div. So that doesn't look quite the same. And if we look closely, we can see that if we do view, there's a typo here. So that would explain it. So where does this come from? I'm just going to Control C. I'm going to do Control Shift and F and find that. And I can see in my launch settings, there's a typo. So at some point I must have accidentally got rid of the E. So that's a small example of investigating an issue by stepping into third-party code. Now I did that whilst debugging, but if I stop debugging and I go to program, just like remember how you can control click or press F12 to go to our own definitions, you can do that with third-party code as well. So if I control, and you can see that if I hover the mouse, I get that cursor, that hand cursor. If I click on it, it does the same thing. So I'm not debugging now, I'm just clicking into it. I can click on the new, so control click, going down. We know where it is now, so it was in here, control click, go down. It was in apply default app configuration, and we can go down and we can see add user secrets. We can even go into that, and we can see what this is doing. Internal, we can see it's doing something with a path, which will be my user folder, add secrets file, and it's calling add JSON file on that secret. So you can see how within this familiar environment, we can still step into code, even if it's not our own. Another JetBrains product called .peek, which is free to download, is a separate desktop application that allows you to disassemble .NET DLLs. But in Rider, we also have that functionality. So clicking here, Assembly Explorer, all the ... will be in here if it's not pinned. Then we can click on Open. We could load a .NET DLL. There's a few other options. You can explore a folder, open from GAC, and there's a few, you can save assemblies, so you can clear this list. If I just open something from the GAC as an example, anything really, then we can see we can start looking through these namespaces. If I go to like one of the classes, then we can see this code. So this Assembly Explorer is built in. I mentioned before about like this debug and release mode, and if something's compiled in release mode and things have been optimized, this concept of symbols. So you've probably seen, if you've done .NET development, that quite often when you build your application in the bin folder, you've got your DLL files, but you've also got something called the PDB file, the PDB extension next to it. And that stands for Program Database, and that holds a lot of debug information. If I go back to like Program, and I'm going to run to this breakpoint again. Now, if you remember this Modules tab, and I did mention in the first video in this module that I never really use this. And the reason is because if I'm stepping into third-party code, I just trust it's got the symbols from somewhere. But if you are curious, if I step into this F11 and go to the very top, and I can see that this is namespace Microsoft ASP.NET Core. So if I go to modules and find this, which is here, I can see the path. So if I right click and say navigate module location, then we can see where it is. So that's just in C program files, .NET shared, it's in the .NET stuff. There's no PDB next to it though. So if I close this and look along, so we've got the symbols column, we can see that this came from symbol source server. So Rider we've known to download this from a symbol server. If we go to settings, Control Shift and S, then there's a couple of places of interest. In tools, external symbols, it says use sources from symbols where available, allow downloading symbols from remote locations, enable private source link support. So I'll mention that in a sec. Decompile methods. So there's a few options here. Also in build, execute and deployment, we've got the debugger, you've got symbol servers. So you can set up your own symbol servers for your private PDB files. That source link thing I mentioned is very cool. It's not a Rider thing, it's a .NET thing. So here we've got .NET source link and it talks all about it. And basically allows you within your NuGet packages to embed information that tells it about the source code, about where that comes from. And that could be like a GitHub repository so that when you're debugging into it, the tooling, in this case Rider, knows where to get the original source from, like on GitHub, and then it can use that information as you're debugging through. Going further into this is out of scope of this talk, but github.net source link, this article provides a lot of information, and there's a lot of information online about source link. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of stepping into third-party code and investigating not just in the debugger, but also just disassembling third-party code. In the next section, we're going to look at debugging multi-threaded code. In this video, we're going to look at debugging multiple threads in Rider. So sticking with the same project, I've added an extra class, threads.cs, which has an execute method. And all I'm doing here is I've created a few threads just for us to play around and look at the debugging UI. So I'm creating 3 threads. They are named, so we'll see them in the debugger. Thread 1 calls doWork1. Thread 3 also calls doWork1, but thread 2 calls doWork2. And we're also creating a thread via task.run, which calls doWork3. And then finally, we're creating a long-running task. So we're just doing standard async await. I'm not awaiting it here because I want it to be fire and forget. So that squiggly warning is because I'm not awaiting it, but that's fine. So these do work methods, all they're doing is an infinite loop where we do a console write line and then we sleep for 2 seconds. Ignore this line, I'll come back to this shortly. That's for something else I want to demonstrate. And doWork1, doWork2 and doWork3 all do the same thing except a slightly different message. And if I go to the top, this execute method is just in program.cs. I'm just calling threads.execute. So it's a static method. So let's debug this now. So I'm running our application in the debugger. And we can see that every 2 seconds, we're getting these messages appearing. If I go to our hard-coded podcast source and just bob a breakpoint there, and then go to the HTTP and run this. So we've now hit our breakpoint as we've done before. So let's revisit this debugging pane down here. We've seen this already in the course, but we've kind of like skipped over this bit. And this shows all the different threads. So I can click through and you'll see that the call stack which we've seen relates to the selected thread. So this top one is the current API request that we've made. When you see .NET TP worker, TP stands for thread pool. And you've also got this thread pool gate, which I believe is responsible for creating these different thread pool workers. But quite often when you see .NET TP worker, that is a async await call, that kind of thing. So we can see here, this is all asynchronous. We're using task and the caller will be saying await. And if we click through these, we can see this is our do work. And this one, and I think this one is something completely unrelated, but this one will be the one we've run with task.run. And you can see that the call stack here actually says our do work. If I scroll down a bit further, we can see our name threads, so 1, 2, and 3. You'll also see these squiggly symbols here. That squiggle means that the thread is currently stopped, and it's stopped because we're paused in the debugger. So another tab we've not really looked at so far is this parallel stacks. And if I click on this, then we get this diagram. Now it's worth pointing out, if you're following along, if we go back to threads and variables, this call stack view, if I right click on it and say rider show hide library frames, so that's showing all the library methods as well as your own code. If we go back to parallel stacks, this has suddenly become quite big, like one of the threads is actually huge. So if you see it like this, then go to threads and variables, right click and say hide library frames. So then this is a lot cleaner now. And we can see we've got a call stack in here as well. So we can go through the call stack. So that's for this thread. And now we get to the reason why I've got 2 threads calling the same method, because I wanted to show this. These boxes are grouped by threads that call the same methods, so have the same call stack. So you can see this says 2 threads, and if I hover over it, it says the thread names. So actually, if I just change back to threads and go to the top, so we can see this for context. So if I hover over, we've got my thread 1 and my thread 3, and that's do work. So we can see my thread 1 and my thread 3, they both call do work 1. We've also got my thread 2, so that's the only thread that calls do work 2. So it's its own grouping. So I've intentionally done this just so I can show that this is grouping by call stack, and some of these boxes will contain multiple threads. So we can see that this one has 6 threads. And we can also see this one, which is do work 3, but that's called net TP worker. Do you remember me saying that that was very async await related? So that is going to be like this one, which is using the task stuff. So now if we move over to this tab, the tasks tab, so we can actually see that do work 3. So this one is currently running, so the task is active, and we can see that here. It gives information about the location and the initial location. We can also see in the tasks this line here. So the create long running task, which is this one. And actually, if I scroll down a little bit, we can see that was this task delay. And we can see that says awaiting, that's the status. And it is because it's not been 10 minutes, so we are currently awaiting that task. This view you can also view as a graph as well. Another very cool feature in this, which is fairly new, is the ability to freeze threads. So if we go over to here, and you can do this from different views as well. I can do it from here as well. We've got these options, or we can do it from here. We've got the options here. So sometimes when you're doing multi-threaded code, you want to isolate just one thread and stop the other ones so you can just focus on that one thread. So once we're paused in the debugger, what we can do is you could take a particular thread and right click and say freeze other threads. So that's one option. Obviously that's going to stop all threads, which I don't want to do at the moment. I'm just going to, for this demo, I'm going to freeze everything that does a console log. So let's do my thread 1, freeze that thread. Let's do my thread 2, freeze that thread, and my thread 3, freeze that thread. There was also the other one, I think it was this one, right click that one and freeze that one as well, because that was the other do work. So now if I continue playing and go to the console, we can see that it stopped logging out these messages. But I should still be able to run this. Let's get rid of that breakpoint and continue. Do that again without a breakpoint, and I should still be able to run this and get my data back, because this output does not depend on those threads. But it's really powerful that you can just freeze some threads to help you investigate an issue and isolate a particular thread that you're trying to work with. Another useful tip is we looked at breakpoints before. So if I put a breakpoint here, and remember when you right click on it, you get more options. So we're not currently paused in the debugger. So we're missing some options here that we would get if we were. So if we go back to my HTTP request, run it, so I'm paused in the debugger and try again, right click, we've now got this option, suspend only on a specific thread. So if you've got multiple threads calling the same method, and as part of your investigations, you need that breakpoint to only be hit from a particular thread, then you can do this as well. Speaking of breakpoints, if we go back to threads, so I mentioned about this before, this is just an object. If I go to this class, it's just got a string called message. And with each of these, I'm just setting that message. If I just bob a breakpoint here and then resume, it's not going to hit it because I've suspended all threads. So let me just pause the debugger. And if I right click and say unfreeze all threads and then continue, we're now going to hit this. So what I wanted to show is that if you've got an object with a property in, and I've actually got it down here from beforehand, but if I delete that, so I got that here by right clicking and went to add to watches, or another option is you can right click here and say new watch and start typing, and that right click new watch is the insert key. But when you expand this and you've got your property, you can right click and say set data breakpoint. Now what this does is it'll break when that property gets changed. So if I do that, so you can see it's got an eye icon here to indicate that a data breakpoint has been set. Now if I continue, let's just get rid of that breakpoint and continue again. We can see it's hit that data breakpoint, and it's even shown the previous and the new value. So that's actually useful not just in multi-threaded code, but in general, data breakpoints if you just want to see when a property of an object changes. So with that, that's actually the end of the debugging module. And Rider's got so many different little things. There's going to be bits I haven't covered, I've not been able to cover, but that covers most of the stuff. I've intentionally not covered anything about performance debugging because we'll look at performance later on in the course. But other than that, that should give you a really good grounding of how to debug in Rider.